I have my 2-inch aluminum mounted in my 4-jaw chuck. Now I want to find the center so that I can set up my tooling. Once I set up my tooling, I'm going to remove the face of my material, which is called facing. That way it'll sit nice in our chuck. It'll be nice and flat when it sits in there. Once we do that, we will then adjust our tooling, and then I'm going to remove the side of the material, which is called turning. So find the center, face it to make it nice and flat, and then turn it to make it nice and round. We will then flip our billet around back in the 4-jaw chuck, do the same thing on the other side, so that we have a piece of material that is nice and square, round all the way in the same place. The center is equal. We're not dealing with an extrusion that was, banged around at the shop. We need a nice, smooth, perfectly square piece of material. And that's what we're going to do here. But first, let's find that center. We have to load a center drill in our chuck on our tailstock so that I know that the chuck is securely mounted in the tailstock. Then I'll move the tailstock so the tip of the center drill is approximately 15 millimeters away from the surface of that material. And that's what you're seeing right now. Although it looks like the tip of that material is touching the edge, from the angle that we're looking at our material, the tip is approximately center. It's just about 15 millimeters away from our material. I will then lock my tailstock down with a wrench, make sure that it's securely in place, turn my headstock by hand to make sure that it's freely moving and nothing's locked in place, turn the metal lathe on, and slowly advance the tailstock's chuck with its handle. That first couple millimeters is smaller than the rest of the center drill. It tapers slightly, then it goes straight, and then it tapers again, and then it goes straight again. Make sure that when you mount your center drill that you do not grab onto the flutes of the center drill. Make sure that it's in there securely and tighten all holes in your chuck. Our machine is ready to go. Everything's clear. I have my safety glasses on. No gloves, no strings, no hoodies, no baggy clothes, no chains. Make sure that you check all your safety precautions before you begin. The headstock is moving freely. Our material is securely mounted in our chuck. The tailstock is secure. The chuck is advanced approximately an inch and is about 15 millimeters away from our material. I'm going to turn my machine on and advance the center drill with the handle of the tailstock. Make sure that the chuck is not locked in place on the tailstock. We want to be able to advance our chuck, and we don't want it locked in place. We want the tailstock itself secured to the bed, but we want to make sure that the chuck can freely advance forward and backward with the wheel located at the back of the tailstock. Let's get started. Slowly advance the tailstock. 3 millimeters away. Now don't jam it in there, go kind of slow. You could use a little lubricant at this time. But it goes pretty easy, so for the sake of messing up my camera, I'm not going to do that. Aluminum is a soft material, and it's fairly gummy. Okay, you can see I got that first part of the center drill in there. And currently I have the chuck advanced about 1.5 inches. So that's pretty far. I don't want to go a whole lot more. I don't want to advance this a whole other inch or anything, but I can keep going with this. You could get a little closer if you needed to, but you want to make sure that the chuck is secure in the tailstock so that it doesn't accidentally get caught in your spinning material and then get dislodged from your tailstock. So let's go back in there. We've got our center. So at this time I'm gonna stop. So that's plenty. You don't need to go very deep into your stock, and you shouldn't really go very wide and taper that open, because the only reason we're doing the center right now isn't for drilling holes, it's for finding the center of the material so that we can align our tooling with the center. You could even go a little bit smaller. Just all you need is a little dot there to be able to align your tooling. We're done with the center drill and the tailstock. So you could remove the chuck, unlock the tailstock from the bed, and then take it all the way back to the end of the bed. You might as well take the chuck out. At the very least, take out the drill bit so you don't accidentally stab your hand or any part of your body, because you're going to be really focused on the headstock and you don't want to lean in and accidentally catch yourself or hurt yourself on the tailstock. So I normally just remove the chuck itself. Now that I have my tailstock moved all the way to the end of the bed, I'm going to remove the chuck and the tooling. And at this point, we want to get our carriage into place, load in our tool holder. I'm going to strictly use the cross feed. The cross feed is going to go perpendicular to the bed, and that's what I need to do to remove the front face of my material. Facing, you use the cross feed, going forward and backward. And then to remove the material on the side, to turn the material, you're primarily going to advance your tooling with your carriage with the wheel on the front of the apron. Load in your tool post, your tool holder, and your tooling. I want to always start off of my material, and then I want to get lined up as much as I can with the tip of that, get that lined up with this edge. That's good. So I'm going to go ahead, bring it back here, and then I'm going to go to the left a little bit. I'm going to advance the carriage. I'm going to advance the carriage a little bit. So that I can take off like a 64th of an inch, just a little sliver, and just run one pass and we'll see how it goes. So make sure you have your safety equipment, everything's tied back, your hair, scarves, all those things, and let's get to machining. Once again, make sure the tool is not touching the piece. Make sure the headstock moves freely and that nothing is engaging with anything else. You don't want to get the front of your cross feed hitting the jaws of your chuck. You'll notice on a lot of lathes, the front end of the cross feed, it's all banged up because people are knocking it into the jaws. So now that I've inspected my lathe and I'm sure nothing is going to hit, I know that the tip of this is back far enough that it's not going to hit our stock, and it's over far enough to the left that it's going to start machining. And just slowly advance. Don't jam it in there. Just slowly go forward. You're going to be nervous at first, but it's not going to snap anything. It's just going to pop some chips off. Okay, so that feels pretty good. I'm going to check that real quick. I turn my lathe off and just inspect the work. I'm going to use the tip of my fingernail just to kind of go back and forth and see if there's any grooves in that. And it feels pretty good. It's not perfectly smooth, but I can't really feel any grooves either. So now what I want to do, now that I feel like my angle is set and I'm safe with what's happening, we have to lock down our carriage. So there's going to be a nut. It's probably going to be the same wrench that you've been using. So you're looking for a square-headed nut on top of the carriage, closest to you, and you want to lock that down. You don't have to crank it, just snug it up pretty good. And what that's going to do, it's going to lock the carriage so it doesn't move back and forth. Otherwise, the force that's being exerted on the tool, it's pushing things back. So it's actually going to eventually move the whole carriage to the right if you don't lock it down. And you could have done that from the very beginning as well when we first did our first pass. Let's turn everything on. There we go. So now I'm barely even touching it so that I can continue my cut. And you can see that nice little swarf that pops off of there. Don't grab it. You're going to be attracted to it. You're going to want to grab it off, especially if you get a nice steady stream going. Use a pliers, wait till the lathe is done, and then you can get it out of your way. If it's getting in the way and it seems unsafe, then absolutely make sure that you remove that with a pair of pliers after you turn the machine off. So I get a little squeak in there. You could add some lubricant at this time. And it was also because I slowed down a little bit while talking. So if you repeat that, it'll kind of start to squeal. It's chattering on that surface, meaning that bit's kind of just bumping up and down and rubbing on that surface. So make sure that you are listening to what's happening. Like, that's pretty quiet. It's pretty smooth. If you're all nervous because it's making a lot of noise and things are moving in ways that you don't think they should be, then something's probably wrong. You want a nice shiny surface when you first machine it, and then you can always go back with a file and sandpaper. So a lot of machining is just standing here and slowly turning a dial. You can try to exert a little more force if you think you're going too slow. You can also increase how much you're taking out at a time. I'm doing about 1 millimeter. That's what I feel safe with. You could get a bigger bit on a bigger lathe and take off more material, but that's about what I want. So once we get past this, it's still machining. It's just very quiet because we're towards the center and we're almost done. And then I'm going to back that off. And it should be fine. I shouldn't have to pull the carriage back to the right because I just removed all that material, so it shouldn't be touching. Turn the lathe off. Do not touch it until it stops. It's okay. It feels pretty good. It's smooth, but I can feel a little bit towards the center. As it got kind of quiet there, it actually created some grooves. So I could actually change this angle a little bit and decrease the gap between the back edge of our tooling and the front edge of our piece. So since it's locked into place and that wedge is in the correct position, you can just loosen this up and go left and right a little bit. So I'm just going to loosen it just a little, but it did move. And I want to increase, I want to decrease that angle, so I'm going to push it forward just a little. Okay, loosen up a little more until it's easy. Too much. That's pretty good. So let's try that. At this time, you want to start adding lubricant. That'll help everything out. Slowly advance. You don't want to go so slow that you're barely moving, but you don't want to go so fast that it feels unsafe and you're feeling a lot of resistance. I'm going forward fairly fast, and there's very, very little resistance happening. So I'm just going to keep going. And you can see all that swarf starting to build up. And that could be a hazard. So at this time, I'm going to back off my cross feet a little bit. Come back. Turn off the machine. And this is going to be hot and it's going to be sharp, so be very careful with your hands. Remember, you don't have gloves on while doing this. Make sure there's enough room. If you can easily pop that off with your hands, then just flick it with your fingers. Lubricate and resume. Go slow. Once you clear that edge, you can advance quickly until you get to where you left off, and then go slow again. Then you can continue at a regular pace. If you engage that front edge, if you engage the cutting edge too fast, it can actually catch under center and move your stock and create some pretty bad damage to your machine or your tooling or yourself. And if we didn't have that hole drilled, like maybe we're trying to face this so that we have a really smooth surface with absolutely no hole there, you might get a little button on there. If you get a little button on there, it looks like a little nipple, then that's going to be a little below center. That's okay. You know, you can always file that off. So that just means you got to raise your tooling a little bit. So when you're done with this, if you have no hole on the center of your stock, it should just go perfectly smooth. So you have maybe a tiny, tiny little needle there, which will break off. Make sure you have no open containers, you know, that you're going to be drinking out. This metal is going to go in there. It's going to have oil. You don't want to ingest that. These metal shards, these little pieces of swarf, get really hot, and that oil gets hot as well. So you want to make sure that if that lands on your skin, you know what's happening. I'm going to actually stop the machine right here because I want to show you the front. Our front edge feels really nice. It feels better than it was before. I'm going to unlock the carriage, leave everything else in the same position, and just back it off. Let's take a look at that front edge. There we go. We can see some grooves, but they're not very sharp. They're kind of rounded. That could be due to cheaper tooling. That could be dull tooling. And that's pretty, you can barely feel that. You can see it more than you can feel it. So you would just file with a file. You could readjust. try a different bit. So either the bit's gonna get dull or cracked. The angle might be a little bit off, so you might wanna check that, and also check to see if you're on center. It's usually gonna be one of those three things, but it could be the tooling. And in many cases, that tip will actually be rounded so that you don't get those sharp little lines. That you can get out very easily. So I went back and did a finishing pass, and I only took off about 1/2 millimeter. Could have even done less. So quarter of a millimeter, 1/2 millimeter off. You're just trying to shave just the front end off. And what a difference. I'm not sure if you can tell as well in the camera, but this is really smooth. The only lines that are appearing in there are just because I'm manually advancing the carriage, and I may sit in one spot a little longer, so it might kind of polish it up or dig in just a micron or so, just a very, very small difference. You can't feel those rings in there. It is so smooth. So what helped was going slower. I used the same bit. I just went slower, and I didn't even change that angle. I did change it during the first pass. We did that first pass, and it felt kind of rough, so we changed that angle. And then we did our second pass, and that felt really good. And then so I went ahead, went slower, took off less material in what is called a finishing pass. And that smoothed it up really nice. So now I know that this surface is perfectly square to my bed. So now when I take this out and flip it around, I know that that's gonna sit perfectly flat against the faceplate of our lathe. And that's gonna help ensure that every time we have to turn this piece around, if I wanna do some machining here, take it out, put it on the drill press, and put it back in, that's gonna mean that the center is gonna stay pretty true. If I just needed something carved here to the back, and it was simple, and I was gonna chop it off and have a flat back, there wouldn't be a lot of planning. I drill my holes, cut it, whatever, I'd be done. But since I wanna take it off of the machine, flip it around and do things to it, and I need to ensure that that's center. Because if my center changes, if I put this back in our chuck and that center is different, and I have like maybe a radial pattern drilled in my surface, and then I go ahead and machine that radial pattern away, or at least partially away, you're gonna see the difference, and things are gonna be off center every time you take it out of that chuck. Now that we're done facing it, let's go ahead and take a look at our tool and our tool holder so that we can do a turning operation. Let's bring our carriage back. You want to have your tooling towards the tailstock, so off of it, but you want to advance the crossfeed towards the center so that you're taking off, you know, maybe 1/2 millimeter or 1 millimeter. A little closer. That looks pretty good. And so this time, you know, what I usually do is just pull back on everything. Sometimes there's a little bit of slop in the carriage and the compound. So just make sure everything's pulled back, and this didn't move at all. Now I want to make sure the compound is not locked down, because we're going to be going to the left. If we lock it down, we won't be able to advance to the left. The whole point is to remove this material. So I only machined a little bit because I wanted to see how that surface feels. It looks pretty good. You can see how shiny it is. So I think we're pretty good on that. I think I might be taking a little bit too much of a cut out at once. You can see the tip of our tool is getting a little shiny. It might actually crack. We might actually break that off. So I'm gonna take a smaller bite. And so I'm gonna back it off just a little bit and try again. And that is really smooth. It does look a little choppy, so I think I could probably lower it just a little bit, but that's looking pretty good. The other thing you gotta be careful is this edge here sometimes will peel backward. If your bit is dull, it might peel, and I can feel that. It's like a serrated edge right here. So you got to be super conscious of the edges. This edge is the same here when I did this. So this tool might be a little dull, and you can actually see that there's this shiny spot on the tip of the tool. So you may have to change that out. But this looks really nice. So I'm going to go ahead and at this point I'm going to start using lubricant more because I'm going to be using a lot of material. And I'm also going to readjust how much I'm taking off. This is too much. Even this is too much. I want to barely touch that surface. So I'm going to pull back even a little bit more because I actually need to use the whole diameter of this piece as much as possible. So I have a lot of length here that I can lose. In fact, I'm going to machine quite a bit of this off. But for, you know, usually you want to machine what you need, check it with the calipers, and then if this is good, then you can take the whole piece down. But I just want to do a little bit. So I'm going to come in, back off just a little bit more, and it's right there. There's a little line I just scribed. So it's barely doing anything, and that's what I'm going to try to do. That looks really great. And the edge isn't peeling either. There's hardly anything being taken off, so let's take a look at the whole thing, make sure that it's being taken off all the way around. Looks pretty good. So I'm going to continue and advance and do this to the rest of this edge. And then I'll clean this up a little bit, and then we'll flip our piece around. Can you see that? So it's like touching, not touching, touching, not touching. It's not that the tool is moving, but our stock is a little thinner and a little wider somewhere. So if we continue that, we're not going to get that fully machined surface. It'll have a scratch or a dip in that surface. So I'm going to advance a little bit more. Go off to the right. Then I can advance a little bit more. Just a tiny little bit. And while this becomes mesmerizing, you want to make sure you watch for that corner. And also that you watch for that nut. You don't want anything coming into contact with the chuck. It could be a catastrophic failure. So I'm just going to keep going and going as far as I can and just look at it from the top view, making sure that my hair is pulled back, my hoodie is out of the way. And I just want to make sure that I can advance as far to the left without any of my tool holder or my compound or carriage hitting anything else. So that's about as far as I feel comfortable with. It's pretty good. It's pretty smooth. It's got a little bit of lines in it, but they're not super sharp and pointy. I could take a little bit of sandpaper and smooth that out, but that's really pretty smooth. That doesn't hurt. I can barely feel those bumps. But I think that tooling is getting a little dull, and that's why you're getting you're getting a few bumps on there. So if you go to the left all the way, you can then, with the machine, turn by hand, and then go as close as possible so that nothing's hitting here. You're not hitting the tooling against the jaws. And I'm about 3 millimeters away from the jaws. You can't see it from this angle, but I am so close it's uncomfortable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to advance the carriage while turning this by hand. So I'm going to disengage the belt to make it a little easier. I'm going to move the compound forward, and you'll see I'm scribing a line. So I know not to go past that line. So if you need to mark some lines, you can always turn this by hand, grab hold of the chuck, and just turn it as you mark it with the tip of the tool. If I put this in the jaw of my chuck, it's not going to engage down here because this is machined away more than this is. And I'm going to remeasure this because I have more than I need. So I'm actually going to machine some of this away because when I take it off and flip it, I'm going to drill holes. And the deeper that I drill, I'm going to use about 1/8 inch drill bits. And the deeper my drill bit goes, the more likely it's going to go off center and then it will wander. So if I need 1/4 inch holes from the top of my surface and I have to, you know, start here and then I have to machine all this away, my drill bits might wander. I'm gonna do a finishing pass just to smooth that out. And you can see the shine change. It gets shinier because it's smoother, because I'm going slower. And you can see I sat there for a second because I had to reposition my hand. And then you got this white line that came in there because my bit either moved a tiny bit, which it probably does. It's probably vibrating in there, so it's going to cut a little bit deeper, and that's why you get scratches. That's called chatter, when the bit's moving around and bouncing around. And then you hear it squeak a little bit. So if you were a machine, you could consistently go forward and you would have no lines on there. Now you can see the swarf is building up. You do not want to grab that with your hands. You want to make sure that doesn't ball up and create a blockage and then possibly damage your workpiece and dislodge your tooling. I'm going to back off right away. And I'm well clear of that groove that I put in there. I could go a little bit more, but I just want to stay clear. Now it almost looks like a buff piece of metal. I can see my fingers in there. It's a little foggy, but that would sand and buff up pretty fast. So I feel good about that edge. Before I flip the piece around, I want to check for any burrs. And there is a sharp edge down here, and I can feel, using my fingernail, you may have actually seen that piece flick off. There's a slight burr, so I'm going to use a file. Turn it on real quick. And you, if possible, even if you're right-handed, if possible, try to file from this side. A lot of people will reach over the chuck and file, and that can be really dangerous. It can also be dangerous filing with your left hand if you're more clumsy, if you're normally right-handed and you're trying to file with your left hand. So just be very careful. I'm not going to cover a lot of filing, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. And I'm just kissing it just a little bit to get that burr off. Let's go ahead and turn that off. Wait for the machine to turn off. Don't touch that edge until it's not spinning. And then just gently touch it. So now it's sharp, but there's not a burr on there. So I'm going to just take a little bit of sandpaper. Take a little bit of sandpaper. I'm not really applying any force, and I'm not grabbing it with the sandpaper. You can go on that edge a little bit. If you're doing it from the top and you're doing it pretty hard, it can be difficult because it'll push it. You'll get like a kickback. It'll push it this way. Doing it from the underside is pretty smooth, but you got to be careful not to grab it because it can pull your hand under. So generally speaking, I go a little bit below center. You know, kind of, I do this a little bit once in a while, kind of come to the bottom. But if you don't remove that burr first, it's going to cut through the sandpaper and cut into your finger. So make sure the burr, you could even take your sandpaper, double it or triple it up, and just come in and get that edge. I'm also going to get this a little bit too. That's a really nice edge. It's not too sharp. I can put my thumb on it. At first, touch it lightly, but I can feel I can actually go this way with it. It's not going to cut me. So now that my diameter has changed, I can't just simply take it out and put it back in and tighten these up in the same place because now the jaws have to come in more. So you're going to have to take this piece out, put it back in, bring in your dial indicator again, get this perfectly centered, and then just repeat. You're going to face, this time, you know, this edge is going to be over here, so you're going to face that edge, your new face, and then you're going to turn the remainder of this material till you get down to here. And we're probably going to get to that and then have to do one more pass. So I'm slowly losing material, but that's fine. I need approximately 2 inches, actually a tiny bit under. So this is going to be perfectly fine for what I need. And I only need it for just a tiny little bit. If you need things to be perfect, then you may have to actually step up your stock. I needed 2 inches. I know that I could center this pretty good, and 2 inches is pretty good for my project. If you needed this to be a high tolerance piece and you need this to be exactly 2 inches, then you should get a bigger piece of material, such as 2 1/4. or whatever it steps up to. You should get a bigger piece of material. Make sure that you're cleaning off the ways in the bed. Remove any debris throughout your machining process. Use a brush, a small chip brush. Something you can just brush that stuff with. You use your hands, you're gonna get small slivers, small bits of metal. You're gonna get oil in your fingers. It's gonna irritate your skin. So just try to sweep it all away, and also keep these ways clean. But you also want to keep them oiled. So if they look like they're drying out, apply some oil to the ways.